Uniunea Europeană își păstrează unitatea în fața problemelor grave, dar dacă pe termen lung nu face mai mult pentru cei pe care îi sprijină, pot să apară fisuri la nivelul blocului comunitar. Principiul locului rămas liber, pe care îl ocupă imediat altcineva, se aplică și în cazul statelor care vor să devină membre UE, dar încă mai au de rezolvat o serie de probleme. Pericolul ca Rusia și China să-și dezvolte propria agendă în aceste țări este constant. La fel de permanentă este și întrebarea cât mai poate fi păstrată această stare de fapt. Discutăm cu John O'Brien, profesor titular al catedrei Jean Monnet pentru integrare europeană la Universitatea din Irlanda. Sunt Cristina Cileacu, începe Pașaport diplomatic. John O'Brien, professor holding Jean Monnet Chair of European Integration, welcome to Diplomatic Passport.
Thank you.
Drumul spre statutul de membru al Uniunii Europene este dificil, dar ce faci când, pe lângă regulile clare de îndeplinire a criteriilor de la Copenhaga, țara ta are de înfruntat un război. Ucraina este sub bombardamente constante din partea Rusiei și, din păcate, lista celor care suferă de pe urma agresivității rușilor s-a mărit. Republica Moldova are probleme mari din cauza atacurilor hibride comandate de la Moscova.
Professor, my first question is about the integration of Ukraine, a country that is still in a war started by Russia, and the Republic of Moldova, a country that suffers hybrid attacks from the same country, Russia. They want to follow the European path. The way EU is supporting them right now, is it enough, considering how difficult is their situation?
Well, I think, firstly, it's clear that the European Union, prior to the 24th of February this year, was kind of content to have Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia sit in this sort of strange antechamber where they had aspirations towards EU membership, but those membership aspirations were really not being progressed. The 24th of February, I think, has changed a lot. Ukrainians are literally dying for the values that are enshrined in the European treaties. Moldova, similarly, has provided great support to Ukraine. It has a clear ambition towards the European Union and towards membership. And I hope that across national capitals in Europe, it's now clear that we have to meet those expectations. We have to progress the membership aspirations of Ukraine and of Moldova in the years ahead, and that should not come at the expense of the existing candidate states in the Western Balkans. We have work to do across all these jurisdictions in integrating countries where both elite opinion and popular opinion is overwhelmingly in favor of being part of the EU.
When the Ukrainian war will be over at some point, because we do understand the history of Russia, but none of us is willing to understand Russia's aggression. How should the relationship between European Union and Russia should look like?
Well, in some ways, we can watch the last sort of 30 years of the EU-Russian relationship as a tragedy. I thought there was every possibility in the 1990s that Russia and the European Union could draw significantly closer together. During the Yeltsin administration, I remember that there were all kinds of possibilities being floated, including potentially that Russia might become part of the European Union. All that disappeared once Putin came to power. It was very clear to me that even in the earliest days, he and the people around him were dedicated to this process of literally stealing everything they could. And the key difference, I think, that you could see emerge in 2013-14, when the Russians were putting pressure on Ukraine not to sign the Europe agreement that was in the offing, was that it offered the prospect that Ukraine would increasingly become governed by the rule of law. That is the one thing that Putin and his acolytes could not abide. And I think subsequent to that, of course, we've seen this deepening of authoritarianism to the point where Russia might now be considered a totalitarian country rather than authoritarian. I don't think that's going to change in the near future, even if we see the collapse of the Putin regime. What might replace him is even worse. And actually, even if you look at the liberals like Alexei Navalny, their attitudes also encompass a lot of this great power Russian thinking and this sense that Russia should have the natural right to dominate its neighbors. It doesn't, and the European Union should be very clear about that.
And is it? Do you think the European Union understands this?
I think it's been a mixed picture. If we go back to January, there was a lot of disagreement amongst the member states. After the 24th of February, that changed for the better, I think. But the longer the war goes on, the risk is there, obviously, that some member states are rather under pressure because of the energy crisis, amongst other things, might sort of hive off from the unified European position. That hasn't happened thus far. I think the level of violence that the Russians are perpetrating in Ukraine, in a way, is militating against that. But we're going to have a very difficult winter. There will be diplomatic challenges, as there are challenges in individual member states around energy, and the Europeans simply have to stick together on this.
Well, in the same time, Russia is using its influence in the Western Balkans because it's present there, it's using a lot of propaganda, and that affects the member states of the Western Balkans that want to become members of the EU. Is European Union present enough in the Western Balkans to counter this?
Well, we should remember that after the war in Kosovo in 1999, the European Union made a promise to the countries of the Western Balkans at the Thessaloniki summit in 2003. And that was that those states in the region that wanted to become members of the European Union would become members. Now we are 2 decades on from that promise. Not only has it not been delivered, in some ways the situation is worse now than it was then. In part, as you say, because of the very deliberate and recurring Russian efforts to disrupt the region and because of Chinese investment in the region. That's because of the absence of the European Union. I think we need to understand that what has happened in Ukraine is a warning about what might happen in the Western Balkans. We should commit as Europeans to bringing the Western Balkan states into the EU sooner rather than later, and we should be much more involved, I think, in the domestic politics of these states to counter the disinformation that's associated in Serbia, for example, with those pro-Russian elements.
Well, European Union delivers programs, delivers money to these countries that are willing to enter the European bloc. But we look at the experience that EU had with Russia. It really misunderstood to get its intentions. And then we saw the war in Ukraine. Do you consider that European Union understands for real the Western Balkans?
Well, I think there's been, over the past decade or so, a sense in some member states that enlargement of the EU has gone too far and that we should just stall. Now, I don't think a position of stasis is going to deliver anything but further uncertainty, and that then means you've got an environment where the worst kind of impulses can thrive. The Western Balkan countries, I think, more than anything, need stability, and that can come from a concrete promise of membership. And in my view, we need to set a date. We know from the history of enlargement negotiations, there's a direct link between the degree of seriousness of the EU's promise to the candidates and the amount of reform, EU-oriented reform, that takes place in those countries. For many years, the elite actors in politics in the Western Balkans, they simply don't believe that the European Union is serious about the promise made in Thessaloniki. So I think we must revisit this, we must recommit, and we should set a deadline. And that deadline is not just one-way traffic where the EU delivers for these countries. They have to deliver as well. There are deep and serious problems in all of the Western Balkan states. But in my view, many of these problems are caused by the lack of commitment on behalf of the EU and the deep uncertainty that exists in all these states about their future.
Bulgaria vrea schimbarea Constituției din Macedonia de Nord pentru ca această țară să fie acceptată să adere la Uniunea Europeană. Motivul disputei este bazat pe istorie și moștenire culturală. Macedonenii de Nord trebuie să recunoască minoritatea bulgară din țara lor.
And situations like that between North Macedonia, for instance, that actually fulfills quite a lot of the Copenhagen criteria, and Bulgaria, how is this helping European Union? How is this helping the Western Balkans?
It doesn't help. It's a big problem. In my view, looking at the dispute between Bulgaria and North Macedonia, that dispute should be for historians and not for politicians. We can debate history, we can debate identity and language and the importance of those things and the way they have evolved in the region, but that is something that belongs in the academy and not in current politics. But that example that you offer of Bulgaria's opposition to North Macedonia, it's just one example that we could offer of member states within the EU presenting more and more challenges to the candidacy of particular states. This is a relatively recent phenomenon. Prior to 15 years ago, the European Commission used to manage the enlargement process on behalf of the EU, and we didn't see member states interfering. Since then, it's happened again and again and again, and it is really not conducive to good outcomes, not just for the region in the Western Balkans, but for the European Union. So the member states, in my view, should stop interfering in the process. They should leave the Commission manage. They have bilateral relations where they can talk through these issues. And ultimately, the possibility that, for example, in the case of Serbia-Kosovo, you're both going to be part of the European Union. There's an extra incentive there to resolve all of the bilateral and historical difficulties. If you're all part of the same union, those things should not be as important as perhaps they are or were in the past.
Another issue that the European Union doesn't seem to get to the end is the fact that it's not decisive yet in its relationship with China. The European states haven't decided yet how shall we deal with China individually as a union. This is an ongoing debate. In the same time, China is very interested and quite present in the Western Balkans. How this affects the citizens of the Western Balkans, the indecision versus concrete reactions?
Well, two things. Firstly, you said rightly that the European Union had got Russia wrong over a long period of time. I think we can say the same about China. There isn't this sort of benign world of globalization where, you know, the Germans sell as much as possible to China and, you know, we all live in that utopian world. We should acknowledge that under Xi Jinping, China has become more and more a tyrannical state. And we have to think very carefully about all of our relations with China, economic, political, and diplomatic. I think we should be doing an entire audit of the involvement of Chinese companies in member states across the EU. I've advocated this for the university system as well. We should not be signing relationships, partnership agreements with Chinese universities because they are so closely affiliated to the Chinese Communist Party. There's a big, big issue there. And some of the largest member states, I think, have exemplified the problem. In the German case, for example, why would you think about selling part of your important port infrastructure to China? Why would you have Chinese companies involved?
Because you have to save your industry, would be the answer probably of Germany.
But that is then going to present a more longer-term problem because China under Xi has become vastly more aggressive than under any other previous leader. Viewers will have seen what happened at the recent Congress the humiliation of the former President Hu Jintao, because Xi was signaling that he is completely in control. So we have two states, Russia and China, that, in my view, have moved from being merely authoritarian to totalitarian, and we have to rethink, I think, our entire relationship with both states. It's very easy to do that. The case is there in the Russian example,
yeah, but
less easy in China.
Different countries. I mean, Russia is one type of authoritarian, China is completely different type of authoritarian, and of course, we have this philosophy of the European, not philosophy, actually, it's real facts of the European politicians saying that we have to solve what we can solve with China, like the environment or other type of businesses and so on. And then we will talk separately about the disrespecting of the human rights, for instance, inside China. How shall we put this together?
Maybe we have to settle for being a little poorer than we might otherwise be for this change in the market relationship with China. More than anything, however, we should be so careful about allowing Chinese companies into our individual jurisdictions, and in particular in relation to data. I think we've got to revisit that entire area, and we have to acknowledge that China may be moving towards the status of adversary state to the European Union. And certainly, although it's a long way away, if they were to attack Taiwan, I think that would fundamentally change Europe's relationship with Beijing.
După Brexit, situația Irlandei de Nord a rămas încă nerezolvată. Partea Regatului Unit al Marii Britanii, cetățenii nord-irlandezi își doresc să nu aibă graniță cu Irlanda și să fie în continuare incluși în piața unică a Uniunii Europene și în Uniunea Vamală. Chestiunea încă se negociază.
Another specialized you have it's Brexit, because you are a member of the stakeholders group in the Irish government concerning Brexit, and a recent declaration of the Irish Minister of Foreign Affairs, you are Irish, I have to mention that, is the fact that he hopes that till the end of this year the situation with Northern Ireland will be solved. What lessons should both EU and UK draw from this phenomenon, because it was quite bad for both of us?
Yes, but much worse for the United Kingdom. I mean, it's only becoming clear now the catastrophic economic price that they have paid for separating themselves from their nearest neighbour. Their trade with European partners is down about 20% relative to the pre-Brexit period, and I think that situation is going to get worse. Part of the problem is there's been deep instability in London in recent years. Once Theresa May became Prime Minister and she looked like conceding too many things to the EU, she came under attack. Boris Johnson promised that he had all the answers when, of course, he didn't. And there is a sense now, with Rishi Sunak becoming Prime Minister, that the UK may be returning towards a more rational path. And that is very welcome in Dublin, I think. I think it's also very welcome in Brussels and in national capitals. And in the case of the Northern Ireland Protocol, I think there are definite signs that at a practical level, the negotiating teams, the UK and EU teams, are making progress. And I dearly hope that by the end of this year or early next year, we will resolve the problems. The peace in Ireland is too important. And there have been too many people in the Conservative Party and in that ecosystem in Britain who simply didn't care enough about Northern Ireland and were willing to use it as a political tool to try and gain leverage over the European Union. So I'm glad that it appears that era of instability may be coming to an end, and I can see a resolution in sight where Northern Ireland hopefully will have the best of all worlds. It will remain part of the United Kingdom, but it will also be part of the customs union and the single market of the EU, and there will be no border on the island of Ireland.
We are recording this interview the next day after midterm election in United States. And of course, for Europe, United States is the main security provider and it's the most important partner, European Union and United Kingdom both. But let's make a scenario, because we'll have elections, presidential elections in 2024. What if a smarter Donald Trump, let's say, takes over United States?
We have to look at this very, very seriously. The danger is literally staring us in the face, because the Republican Party has now become a kind of cult that worships Donald J. Trump. And there is every chance that Trump will come back to the presidency in 2024. The question then for Europeans is, what happens to us and how can our security be guaranteed? I'm pretty certain that amongst the first things Trump will do if he comes back to office will be to take the United States out of NATO. And that is the point where we have to ask ourselves, why haven't we gotten serious about an independent security capacity? President Macron, I think, raised this as an early point, and he's right that we have to develop an independent capacity to defend ourselves. We face an existential enemy on our eastern border, and I'm very glad that the message that was being sent for many years from Central and East European capitals to Western Europe about the nature of that threat. We finally understand the nature of it now, but in the context of just the craziness of the United States and what might happen in their political system, we have to protect ourselves from the fallout of all of that as much as possible. And I think that means we have to move towards a standing European army, largely located in Central and Eastern Europe, and we have to stop duplicating military resources. We have to find the best ways of actually defending each other as a bloc. I hope that there's a new seriousness after both the Russian invasion of Ukraine and everything that's followed, and what's happening in Washington, that finally we may begin to see that we have to be able to stand on our own 2 feet.
Professor O'Brien, thank you so much for this interview.
Thanks so much.